Welcome to the INSEAD webinar on Empire of AI with Karen Hao and Tim Gordon. I'm Theos Evgeniou, professor at INSEAD, working on the space of AI for almost 30 years and always learning something, especially when I talk with Karen and when I exchange with Tim. Karen, thanks so much for coming.
Thank you so much for bringing me.
Before we start, there is for the audience, please ask questions using the Q&A button of Zoom, and we'll pick them up at the end of the session. We'll have the last 15 minutes for Q&A from your questions, and make sure you vote up, vote down, vote as needed.
Tim? Hi, I'm Tim Gordon. I'm a partner of Best Practice AI and a co-host with Theos of the Age of Intelligence podcast. We're incredibly lucky today to be joined by Karen. Karen Hao is an award-winning journalist who has worked for all sorts of publications, including The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, and the MIT Tech Review. We're here to talk to her today about a fabulous book, which isn't entirely new, but is doing very well, which is The Empire of AI. And we're especially lucky because she's based in Hong Kong, where Typhoon Nando is currently sweeping in and making the entire city rock. So she's here to talk to us about the coming storm.
And I know you have different color books, clearly, Tim. So you got a better cover.
It's the US versus the UK edition.
Okay. So I have the US, I guess. Good. Great book. So, Karen, good to see you. Also, after 2 years of our previous INSEAD webinar in June 2023, I think, a few months after ChatGPT came out and the world got, in shock and everything started. At the time, you were already working on the book, and I was very curious to hear to see what it is, and great to see this coming out a couple of years later. You started working on this way before any of us heard about ChatGPT or even OpenAI, many of us. Can you tell us a little bit about what got you into this? When did you start and why?
Yeah, definitely. So I started working on covering AI in part by accident in 2018. And it was largely because I needed a job and I had studied engineering, worked in Silicon Valley, and then kind of been pegged as a tech reporter when I made a transition into journalism. And quickly from there started reporting, specializing in AI, covering fundamental AI research. And I became the first journalist by pure coincidence to profile OpenAI because at the time they were a fundamental AI research lab, and that is what I focused on covering for MIT Technology Review. So I embedded within the company for 3 days in 2019, and then the profile came out in 2020. And I have pretty much been tracking the company ever since. And so when ChatGPT came out, it felt to me that there was a lot of missing context around the global public conversation that was suddenly happening around this technology and around the company itself. And in order to really understand what this AI revolution that people call it, what it really is, what it means for us, and how we should think about it, I felt like people really needed to understand who it ultimately came from. And so that was kind of the seed of then thinking about, can I create a book, like a single artifact that people can pick up to get that full history on not just OpenAI, but also actually the history of AI itself as a technology and the ambition that originally sparked that field. And ultimately, what is it about the current AI industry and how it operates around the world that can then tell us how we should be governing this technology?
Fantastic. So we've all got piles of AI books on our book stands at the moment. And actually yours is on the book that said real cut through this year. I think it's because you've got a particularly strong and punchy thesis. Maybe you could just sort of articulate that for our audience, what the message of your book is.
Yeah, absolutely. So the title of my book, Empire of AI, is the argument that I make in the book that we really need to think of companies like OpenAI as new forms of empire. And the reason I use this analogy is because if you think about the sheer economic and political power of these companies like OpenAI, Google, Meta, all of the tech companies that have now pivoted into aggressively trying to dominate AI development, you could argue that there's pretty much no nation state government that is more powerful than these companies now. There was maybe a time during which the US government was more powerful than these companies, but under the Trump administration, the US government has had no interest in holding these companies accountable as a counterpower, but rather in just continuing to facilitate their expansionist ambitions. And so that's one aspect of the empire analogy that I just wanted people to understand the sheer scope, scale of how powerful these entities have really become. But the way that they operate also has remarkable parallels to the empires of old. And I draw on four parallels in the book. One is that they lay claim to resources that are not their own. So that refers to, the data that they scrape from the internet and the intellectual property they take from artists and writers. They exploit an extraordinary amount of labor, which not only refers to the labor that they exploit in the process of developing AI, but also the fact that when they deploy AI, it then has ripple effects on the job market and actually limiting job opportunities for many people around the world. The third thing is that they monopolize knowledge production. And what we've seen in the last decade of the AI industry is that these companies are so resource rich that they've essentially snapped up all of the top AI research in the world, researchers in the world. And there's now been a distortion in the actual science of AI research, the same way that you could imagine a distortion would happen if most climate scientists in the world were bankrolled by fossil fuel companies. We would not get an accurate picture of the true state of the climate crisis, and we are not getting an accurate picture of the true capabilities and limitations of AI. We are only getting the picture that these companies really want us to see. And then fourth and finally, empires always engage in this competition narrative, an existential race where there are good empires versus evil empires, and they have to be a good empire because they need to beat back the evil empire. And as the good empire, they are on a civilizing mission where they're trying to bring progress and modernity to the world. And their competitors, the evil empires, if they got a hold of this technology, could bring us to hell.
Can I just so you talk about the power and they've got more power than any nation state. Can you just sort of unpack that a little bit more? Because, particularly for members of the audience who may not be quite as excited about AI as some of us are, can you just talk through why they have that power and what that really means in terms of the real world?
Yeah, there's a couple of reasons why they have the power. One of them is just the sheer amount of financial resources they've consolidated. And just in the US alone, there has been a significant distortion in the politics and the way that the US government or state governments or local governments think about regulating these companies, because these companies spend an enormous amount of money lobbying the different governments to make sure that any regulation that might be inconvenient to them goes away. They really shape the political discourse by pumping a lot of money into campaign donations for different candidates to make sure that those candidates do not create some kind of messaging in their campaign around the regulation of the tech industry. They also engage in initiatives where globally, where they, for example, create partnerships with different journalism organizations, and the media as a whole has really suffered economically. And so when tech companies come and say, we would really like to give you money to experiment with our technologies or help you learn how to use AI in the next generation or the next phase of your evolution as a media organization, it's a really difficult deal to pass up in the context of the media industry being extremely financially constrained. And so there have been many studies that have shown that Google, for example, has been incredibly successful in using this playbook to essentially soften media coverage, perpetuate certain narratives within the global discourse that then informs policymakers about how they're thinking about how to govern these technologies, that now all of the companies like OpenAI and so forth have just picked up on. And so there's kind of they just have a controlling influence on so many different aspects, so many different levers and mechanisms that we traditionally think of as governance mechanisms: regulation, legislation, the media as an accountability watchdog, and then the public's perception of these companies as well.
There's so much in here. I'll pause a little bit and go back to what you said, that they are basically distorting a little bit resource allocation, but also attention, and perhaps more dangerously, or I don't know, more importantly, the path of science, the future of science, because the talent that defines the science and pushes the boundaries of science are basically, or distorted a little bit these days. So in that dimension, one question that always comes to mind is it something about the companies, or is it something about the technology itself? And I'm going to read here a quote from your book that I really love. It's on page 89, where it says, these two features of technology revolutions: first, their promise to deliver progress, and their tendency instead to reverse it for people out of power, especially the most vulnerable, are perhaps truer than ever. Can you unpack this statement based on?
Yeah, so this statement is a synthesis of a book. It's actually right behind me. You can't really see it, but it's a book called Power and Progress, written by two MIT economists, Jeroen Acemoglu and Simon Johnson. And they make this argument in their book that after analyzing 1,000 years of technology revolutions, there are essentially these two features keep coming up and again and again. And the reason why is because in order for an ambitious technology to get the resources and talent for moving it forward, it requires some kind of rallying ambition. There needs to be broad buy-in, and buy-in particularly from people who have the financing power to bring this technology to fruition. And so most often it's the elites of society that actually will invest in the technologies that they think are valuable and worth investing in. But as a result, time and again, we see that they have their blind spots about what actually should technology look like, who should it serve, and how should it work in society, and how do people live in the world. And what happens then is the technology is sort of made in the image of the elites, and it ends up often giving them extraordinary benefit. They enrich themselves from the production of that technology, but it can lead to sort of devastating consequences or the reversal of progress for people that do not live like them and do not look like them or do not behave like them or speak like them, whatever it is. And what the economists say is not that this is, an inherent feature of technology revolutions, and this is just a cycle that we are stuck with forever. What they argue is that we can actually, like, technology is not inevitable. It's a product of human choices, which is why when it's elite people that are making the choices, this is how the shape of technology revolutions ends up going. But they sort of lay out that argument to suggest that there's actually alternatives as well. You can have a broad group of people democratically governing the development and deployment of a technology such that it does not actually just reflect the intentions, motivations, and desires of the elite.
We'll come back to this later because we're very curious about exploring alternatives, and we have to explore alternatives. But before we go there, one stabilizing mechanism, arguably, is competition and markets, right? In some sense, at least competition. So not all comments are the same. And you spend some time in the Valley. There are many players there who compete. Anthropic, DeepMind, Google, Meta now, XAI, OpenAI. From your time at the Valley and also in the space, what are some differences between those companies to highlight? Are they all the same? Are they all falling in the same trap, or there are some differences, maybe from the characters, from the cultures, or whatever else you point out?
To be honest, I don't think that they're much different anymore, at least in terms of in relation to the rest of the world and other types of models for technology development. I think all of these companies now follow a very particular type of Silicon Valley model of innovation where they are really focused on building monopolies, on blitzscaling their user base, on indexing on user engagement and using user engagement as the ultimate groundwork for monetizing and generating more profit. And it is rather unfortunate that all of these companies is sort of collapsed around this particular model of innovation that I am very critical of. Like DeepMind is an interesting case because they started off as also similarly very idealistic with this kind of mission-driven purpose, really focused on trying to apply AI to science. And what we've seen is after the release of ChatGPT and the overwhelming hype around the approach of large-scale AI model development, that DeepMind has now also been co-opted by this particular approach and is now funneling a lot of its resources, talent into that approach rather than investing in the other things that they did. So I think all of these companies have kind of, there's not really a material difference between them anymore.
Competition became co-opetition in some ways. And by the way, this what you said reminds me a little bit also of the social media story, right? Which is probably not too far, which again there was an objective. The markets have to expect for you to make, revenue growth and profits, and revenues come from advertisement. Advertisement sometimes works better if people get a bit more addicted. That helps. So the history kind of repeats. So the parallel will be very interesting. Tim?
Yes, I just building on that. Your critique is a very powerful one, but to some extent, it's a critique of capitalism more broadly, which is, it's exploitative, it's competitive. People play games about who's good, who's bad, all those sorts of things, and there's a real drive to try and monopolize to get higher returns to capital and so on. Is your critique of the AI industry that effectively it's just the same as every other industry, and therefore it's the same thing, or is it that actually maybe you've been on a journey as well, and I don't know, but it could have been something better. It could have been something more idealistic. It could have been something that transformed the world, but it's just actually been sort of reduced back to grubby commerce. I'm intrigued in your thinking on that journey.
Yeah, this is a great question. I think that basically my critique of the AI industry, it is an extreme form of capitalism. Like I don't think that all capitalism is just terrible, like I like living in a society where I benefit from capital products that are developed out of like a capitalistic system. But I do not believe that unfettered capitalism without any kind of guardrails whatsoever is productive. And what we've seen with the AI industry is it's really taken capitalism to its extreme. And at the same time, there is not just a motive of profit that's happening, driving the AI industry. There's also an ideological drive within the AI industry that I think then evolves it from not just an extreme version of capitalism to colonialism. It's the combination of the money and the ideology here that is really interesting. And what I mean by ideology is like there's multiple different ideologies that are driving the AI industry, but one of them is that these companies pray at the altar of scale. They have done that for a long time, as Theos has pointed out. In the social media era, they also were doing that, thinking about like how do we create just massively globally scaled platforms. But they've taken that approach to AI development, where they are trying to scale AI models to an extraordinary and unnecessary size for what they are ultimately trying to achieve. So in this version of large-scale AI model development, it demands a colossal amount of resources. They are talking about hoovering up, they've scraped the whole internet of data, which social media era companies didn't even do. And I often like to use the example of Meta, which was a social media era company and now is an AI era company. When Meta joined the current AI race, they had already accumulated 4 billion user accounts worth of data from the social media era. They considered this not even table stakes for competing in the AI era. And the New York Times reported last year that there were internal conversations within Meta where executives were talking about unwinding all of the privacy regulations that they had implemented post Cambridge Analytica, about potentially they were in discussions about whether they should buy up Simon & Schuster so they could train on all of the books. In the end, they did not do that. They just downloaded all the books from the dark web. And they were talking about continuing to augment their data with other troves, whether to continue scraping from the internet or just like continuing to get users addicted to their technology so that they can keep pouring more and more of that user data into the models. And this is what I mean by just this ideological drive. Like, there's actually no scientific or technical reason for why we need to explode AI models to that type of size. And DeepSeek is a really interesting example here, where a Chinese company produced a model that was significantly smaller in terms of both data and computational resources, but reached the same level of performance as the models that were being developed by OpenAI, Google, Meta across the board in the US. And so some of the things that the AI industry is like that I'm critical of is it's not actually just capitalistic, because if you look at if you look at what they're doing just from a business lens and a financial lens, actually it does not make sense. They are burning an extraordinary amount of money. They have not in any way developed a business model to generate the comparable amount of revenue that would allow them to return a profit. But because they see AI as a narrative cloak around the ability to continue expanding to ever further reaches, this is continuing to kind of perpetuate their hunger for building these AI systems and pouring more and more and more and more resources into it.
I'd love to come back to that point around the business model. Just a question for them, which is one of the wonderful things of your book is it brings out the journey that a lot of the people in the industry have been on in terms of sort of it starts off as very much sort of a bunch of academics coming together, sort of kicking ideas around. You describe the office where they're reading academic papers all day as opposed to sort of focusing on what you might traditionally do in an office. How much can you just describe the journey they've been on? Is this something where actually you described Sam Altman as sort of talking about, a cult is the best way to build a business and his sort of, his quotes around that. Do you think they've all been on a journey, or do you think this has been something they've been sort of been clear from the get-go in terms of just this is who these people are? Related to that, I'd just love to get your thoughts. Have you been on a journey? Did you start off believing that this might be a wonderful thing that could change the world and you've become more cynical, or so just maybe talk about that a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely thought that OpenAI, when I first proposed to OpenAI to profile them, which is why they invited me to embed within the company, I thought this is potentially a really positive case study to cover as an organization because in my own personal journey, like before I went into journalism, I mentioned I worked in the tech industry, I worked in Silicon Valley, and I became very disenchanted very quickly with Silicon Valley because I felt like the incentives ensured that the technologies produced out of Silicon Valley are profitable technologies. And that is not always the same as technology that serves the public good. And increasingly, by the time I joined, which was in 2015, it was clear that profitable technologies actually often directly undermine the public good. And OpenAI was conceiving of itself as a third way, a different solution. Like they were this nonprofit with a for-profit nested within it, where they were like, this is the perfect kind of self-governance structure where we can raise money and benefit from the availability of capital to build capital-intensive technologies. And also, we are going to continue checking ourselves with this nonprofit entity and make sure that we don't just get carried away building profitable technologies. We continue building technologies for the public good. And I was enamored with that possibility. Like I thought if they've actually figured out how to rework the incentives to retain a mission orientation around their technology development, that we should shout this from the rooftops and like everyone should start doing that. Because that was sort of like to me the fundamental issue that we haven't really cracked about why is it that Silicon Valley keeps developing these technologies that end up eroding, democratic institutions and human rights and engaging in labor exploitation and so on and so forth. And I ended up going on this journey where I realized quite quickly after I embedded with them and did around 36 interviews with current and former employees and experts and collaborators and so on for that first profile, that this was actually just an organization that was exactly in the template of any other Silicon Valley company, and that they hadn't actually cracked some kind of secret code. They were actually just using this narrative of being different to distance itself from the old technology companies and the mistakes that they made to continue doing exactly the same thing, but worse. Yeah, I forget the first part of your question. Sorry, there was another part.
I just wondering whether you think they've been on a journey, or whether in fact Sam Altman has sort of
Oh, right.
plotted this from the get-go. You described actually, you articulate, you described the way they started out in a different way as a sort of part, non-profits and so on.
Yeah, so they started off originally as a nonprofit, and then about 3 years in, so they started at an end of 2015 nonprofit. Then about 3 years in, they nest this for-profit arm under the nonprofit. And on one hand, you could say that they went on this journey of being an idealistic organization and then sort of being entrapped by Silicon Valley's system incentives and ultimately like losing that nonprofit ethos and becoming more and more of a commercial capitalistic company like any other company in the Valley. On the other hand, as I have reported more of the story and spent time reflecting on it, I think there was something inherently very corrupted in the beginning of OpenAI's conception because Sam Altman and Elon Musk co-founded the nonprofit together specifically to create AI in their own image. Like they were unhappy with Google making rapid progress in AI development and being the only kind of company that was really dominating that space at the time. And Musk in particular was very anti-Google dominating AI development. He was very worried about a for-profit entity doing that. And so they created OpenAI as we can do it better because we're the good guys. And if Google does it, then it's going to go totally wrong. And so it was an egotistical project from the very beginning, which is already very Silicon Valley. Like a lot of the projects of Silicon Valley are very ego-driven, just as much as they are profit-driven. And so you could argue that it was also a natural consequence that OpenAI ended up evolving into the most capitalistic company in Silicon Valley today, with nearing a $500 billion valuation, the largest valuation for a private company in the tech industry in history, because it was just, they concluded in order to be the dominant player, they needed to scale aggressively, they needed to race aggressively and cross that line first, that finish line first.
Well, what you're saying reminds me of what's written on the dollar, on the US dollar. In God we trust, meaning all others bring good governance. And it's, of course, a governance question, and I strongly believe always that history is shaped by a combination of good technology and science, progress there, and good governance to make sure everything is going well. And therefore, we're not going to get in this board drama of OpenAI. That's a different chapter by itself, and there are plenty of articles written about those, including some we wrote at INSEAD. Let me go back a little bit to the point you made about scale. A little bit like, a myth potentially. And as you were saying this, I was actually checking, the biggest brains of the mammals, and human brain is not the biggest brain. So the whale and the elephant have bigger brain than us, but arguably we're probably more intelligent in some ways at least. So the scale may be a myth, and by the way, the size of the brain, of course, and the energy it consumes is a lot more efficient than everything we've seen. But there is another myth that bugs people, including sometimes myself, which is the myth that we are working towards an AGI thing, which is this amorphous thing that who knows what it means. But worse than this, only us who can do AGI, the rest of the world, just wait for us to do it. Don't move. Sam Altman famously, gave a talk to India before ChatGPT or something, just after ChatGPT, before DeepSeek, sorry, noting that, leave this business to us. You don't have the resources. That was before DeepSeek. And we see everywhere what one can call a geopolitical crusade of big tech to basically deploy their technology, both from US and China and other areas also, right? Also UAE, Europe, I'm sure everybody's doing the same. So it's literally a crusade in some sense.
Yeah.
And I find this kind of, interesting. I don't know what's your take about this AGI myth, and leave it to us to do it.
Yeah, I think you're touching on a really critical point that ties back into what I was saying about how to understand the AI industry, you also have to understand that there's an ideological drive behind it. So the other, I already talked about the scale as the ideological drive, but the deeper ideological drive that underpins the whole thing is this belief that it is possible to recreate human intelligence in computers and that we are imminently getting there. And the reason why I say it's a belief is because there's no actual scientific evidence around this. There was a recent study done earlier this year where 75% of longtime AI researchers, some of the leading minds in the field, not necessarily industry, they actually think that the techniques for recreating human intelligence in computers is either non-existent and or may potentially never arrive. And so people who believe that artificial general intelligence is possible themselves identify as believers. They don't say, that they are AGI scientists. They identify as researchers and AGI believers. So they have a scientific mind, and then they have sort of a religious filter on like what they're working on. And because of this idea, they end up pursuing things like this scale because it actually ties again into your the point that you made about how animal brains, humans do have the largest brain. So one of the theories around how to recreate human intelligence in computers is, of course, trying to model the human brain in software, which is the where neural networks emerged from. And there is a belief, once again, belief that neural networks have already sufficiently modeled the brain. And it's also a belief because we don't actually know enough about the brain to really know whether or not we've successfully modeled it in neural networks. But if you believe that neural networks are, in fact, an accurate representation of the brain, then you would extrapolate from this progression of larger and larger brains equals larger and larger intelligence to thinking, oh, we should just blow up this neural network really, really big in order to get more and more intelligence. But there's actually, quite a lot of evidence to suggest that we haven't successfully figured out the model for the brain in a neural network because of the point that you also made, Theos, that these neural networks are extraordinarily energy intensive and our brains are not. We're able to power our brains, which actually have far more neurons and far more connections than even the largest neural networks just by eating a sandwich for lunch. Like that is not, you cannot run a supercomputer training these systems on a sandwich. And so all of these beliefs and overlapping ideologies, they've become this kind of dogma that has propelled the AI industry in a very particular direction that is actually very unmoored from any kind of real world or scientific evidence. But because there's just so much money pouring into these particular ideologies and this particular approach, there is a lack of scientific rigor being applied to, are we actually on the right path? Is this actually the right way? Should we actually be doing something else?
I'm muted here. And let me just quickly quote something again from the book and then, pass it to you, Tim. In the book, there is page 15 and then page 116. Nothing about this form of AI coming to the fore or even existing at all was inevitable. I like the word inevitable, by the way. Some things are inevitable, but not necessarily the specific form, right? And how. And the page 116, it's not a natural phenomenon, also the scaling thing and maybe this approach. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. I find this very insightful, and I'm wondering what are the alternatives, if any, because we started by talking about, is it actually a characteristic of the people involved, of the companies, of the governance, of the system, capitalism or whatever the system is. China has a different one, or is it a characteristic of technology revolutions? Back to Asimoglu and the book you mentioned, what you shared. That's an interesting question, and of course, practically speaking, to move forward and to go for a call to action for everybody on this webinar, what to do next. But let's work towards what to do next, step at a time. Tim, you are muted. Sorry.
Karen, do you want to come back and do that first?
Yeah, sure. So I absolutely think that, yeah, I firmly believe that actually nothing is inevitable. And I especially believe that the shape of a technology is never inevitable. It is many, many, many human choices that shape how a technology ultimately looks and works or doesn't work on certain groups of people. And part of what I do in the book is I document in detail the moments in which OpenAI made various decisions, sort of on the fly, that then had, profound effects on the way that ChatGPT was then introduced into the world. Like they made a decision at one point to make ChatGPT chat. That was not, it wasn't like suddenly they woke up one day and ChatGPT grew out of the machine chatting. They specifically noticed when they were developing models just for developers that the developers just loved chatting with the models, and they were building all of these different chatbot-like interfaces onto the model already. And that in and of itself had become a really, really popular interface for generating, prompting the model and getting the model to generate text back. And so that was why they then went through a whole effort of, okay, then let's just build our own chat interface. This is the killer app. Like we've already seen in the data from developers that this is the killer app and we should do that. Another decision that they made was they were deciding early on whether or not they should train their DALL-E models on sexual images because they were scraping images off of social media, and the internet is a large place with lots of dark corners, and they were capturing all of this sexual imagery into their data set. And just kind of on the fly, they were like, well, sexual imagery is a part of human life. It is a representation of part of human existence. So yeah, let's put that in. But then this has profound downstream implications in that when you train a model, an image generating model on sexual images, and you train that model on children, you are going to get synthetic child sexual imagery. And that was a decision that, they didn't consult child safety experts. They didn't consult parents, they didn't consult children themselves. It was just something that they decided on the fly. And so the reason why I think it's really important to understand that there is no inevitability in the way that these technologies work is because then it opens up much more space for anyone to get involved in shaping the future of technology. Like if you think that this is just what AI should look like, you would just lie down and let it, roll over you. But really, there's so many different ways to actually, as just like an average person or an entrepreneur or a scientist or a student or a teacher, whatever it is, to actually assert your own preferences on how you think this technology should be developed and deployed in your life. And we can go back to more of that at the end with our call to action.
Cool. And one of the great things about your book is you actually bring out, as you go through the narrative, how these decisions were made and how often they're made for these sort of, often quite, almost random reasons as to why someone chose to go down one path or another path, almost in terms of corporate results. Just a quick call out to the audience. We've had lots of great questions coming in already. Please do add more questions. Keep them short and punchy because then they're easier to ask. But also do go and vote on them. Some really good ones getting upvotes. So please do upvote on more of them. One of the things your book really covers well, and you referred to it a minute ago, actually, is the way in which sort of labor in the global south is increasingly being used to do sort of reinforcement learning, to sort of, you mentioned the child sex work, but just generally sort of looking at the content and responding to it. I guess one of the questions I've got is that if you think about every industrial revolution, it's pretty grim for those involved, whether it's in the UK in the beginning, whether it's China in the sort of the past 30, 40 years. Does this sort of information work? And obviously, there are limits, but does this information work more broadly actually, is this exploitation or is this actually a potential path of development for countries like Kenya that you described some of the downsides of it? So I just wonder whether it's a sort of a necessary evil or whether actually there is some potential upside as well in there.
Yeah, great question. So I think the reason why all previous revolutions, including the Industrial Revolution, had these similar patterns is in part the power and progress argument that Daron Acemoglu and Simon Johnson make, that's, of course, that has been a very common pattern, in part because a lot of technology revolutions happened before human rights was a thing, And so there was a lot more leniency around that kind of exploitation happening. But that doesn't actually have any bearing on how we should actually be thinking about future technology revolutions. We should have much higher standards for future and current technology revolutions because we now do have human rights and we have invented democracy now, and people have a greater sense of human agency and a desire to flourish. And those are things that we should absolutely be protecting and bolstering. In terms of is this sort of an opportunity? So maybe I'll first describe what this work actually is. So anything that an AI model does has to first be taught to it by humans. And Silicon Valley most often has employed large bases of workers in the global south to do that kind of work. So during the self-driving car revolution, there were tens of thousands of workers, primarily in Venezuela, because Venezuela was going through like a devastating economic crisis, that were doing all the hard work of labeling the cars and the traffic lights and the lane markings on the road to teach the model that ultimately operates a self-driving car how to recognize all of these things and then be able to safely navigate the road. And with ChatGPT, I went to Kenya to meet with workers that specifically performed effectively content moderation for what would become ChatGPT. So they were contracted by OpenAI to label reams of the worst type of content on the internet, as well as AI generated content, where OpenAI was prompting its models to imagine the worst content on the internet. And they had to put it into a detailed taxonomy to say, is this sexual content, violent content, hate speech, harassment, and to what degree of severity, so that OpenAI could develop a filter that could recognize all of these different categories of badness and severities of badness, and then be able to eradicate that from ever reaching the user when the model generated something, when ChatGPT generated something in the process of a user conversation. And when I've interviewed so many workers around the world that do this kind of work, and you're right that they actually never advocate for this work to not exist. They advocate for it to be a real job, like a real dignified economic opportunity that gives them skills building, that gives them a career ladder, that gives them good, stable pay, healthcare benefits so that they can actually provide for their families. And the problem is that almost never is this actually the case. These AI companies that are, burning now close to trillions of dollars on building these technologies cannot even pay a couple dollars an hour for some of this work. And so there is a potential to fundamentally reimagine this part of the supply chain so that it's not labor exploitation, but it's actually labor opportunities. And not only would it benefit the workers, it would in fact benefit the technologies themselves, because these technologies are meant to be deployed in a variety of contexts, representing a variety of different cultures, different languages. These workers are actually very skilled workers. They're highly educated. They come from a variety of different cultures, a variety of different skill sets. So why not use this labor base as an asset to making these AI technologies far better at operating in these different contexts, and then at the same time give them that kind of economic opportunity that allows them to raise the floor of that their developing context. And so that is the thing that I've always advocated for when doing this reporting is we just need, this is currently a crisis that could actually be a profound opportunity.
I love this, and we'll come back to these win-win opportunities and alternatives, because you start discussing constructively alternatives. We'll get to constructive discussion in a minute in what to do next. I want to go to an important point that actually for me it was an aha moment when we were discussing about this discussion a couple of weeks ago. Here is what some people say, and in some ways I did the same mistake. How about we build up, scale, whatever the approach is, this technology now, not think about the negative externalities. There are many negative externalities. Let's cross the bridge now. We solve negative externalities later, a little bit like what we did with the Industrial Revolution. Yeah, we had lots of pollution, but eventually we are getting slowly there after many years. And focus on investing now. We saw NVIDIA yesterday announcing 100 billion investment in OpenAI, huge amounts, investing now, and then build AI that will solve all other problems, which was originally one of the missions of OpenAI. It's actually also one of the missions, the mission of DeepMind originally. Our goal is to solve intelligence and use that to solve all other problems, health, climate, energy, you name it, like inequality. Why not do that?
Yeah. Yeah. So there's this is a super common argument, and there's two criticisms that I have of this. The first is it assumes that we have still time to waste away, the planet and our climate, and allow, workers to be wasting away in these exploitative conditions. And that is a very privileged stance that actually only a few people or very small populations of people, elite people in the world actually have that kind of rope to do. We are already in a full-blown climate crisis. Climate has changed. There are already every year, huge I'm dealing with a super typhoon in Hong Kong right now that is one of the largest storms in years, right? And we've seen time and time again, like these kinds of extreme weather events that are accelerated and leaving a lot of devastation in its wake. So that's sort of like criticism number one is the people who usually advocate for these solutions are the ones that do not actually have to bear the brunt of the actual existential cost of taking this approach. But the second one is like, is this approach of scaling all of these models actually getting us to some kind of technology that is going to solve all the problems that you mentioned? And increasingly, the evidence suggests no. And the problem is these models are being trained on, the whole internet. How are we going to get extremely good medical AI applications by training on the internet? That is inherently a flawed premise. Like, you do not create new drugs by training on sexual imagery. Like that's like not, these are not relevant data inputs. And what we have seen is there are plenty of other AI technologies where you do actually have significant advances in things like drug discovery, in healthcare applications, in renewable energy expansion. But these types of AI models look totally different. And sometimes I use the analogy that AI is like the word transportation. Like there's all of these different types of transportation. You have bicycles, rockets, self-driving cars, guzzling trucks. And AI is the same way. You have I feel like generative AI or large scale AI models, they're sort of like the rocket of AI. And they're, generally speaking, they're actually a very small number of use cases, transportation use cases, in which we actually need to deploy rockets. And what these companies are trying to convince us is that every single person needs a rocket for everything, so that you should be using a rocket to commute from Paris to Madrid. Like, that doesn't make any sense. You should actually be using much more efficient, much more tailor-made, task-specific transportation modes to achieve that purpose. And in the same way, we should be moving all of the capital that we're pouring into this nebulous general purpose tool towards task-specific tools that actually tackle the medical advancements, the drug discovery, the healthcare applications, the climate change mitigation, because we've already seen plenty of evidence that those solutions work, and they're significantly less costly than this other approach.
This is a very strong call to action. I must say that in many ways, the Valley does what the Valley does: online advertisement and influencers videos. So currently, we're spending all this compute and energy, and all these other negative externalities to support tools for influencers, which is crazy if you think about this. However, having said this, I'm seeing recently, the past few months, maybe year, lots of hope, also coming from Europe in many ways. Lots of new companies raising hundreds of millions for AI models for, let's say, material sciences, new materials, or bio, or energy, as I said, and other kind of application, exactly as you said, which is also, from what I understand, a little bit China's approach, which is not so much all about the internet. It's also about solving problems, right? Health, transportation, all you said. And I'm wondering whether the Valley is whether the path of the Valley, which is let's develop this nebulous thing, as you said, that currently people use it for, I don't know, their therapist or something, or for influencer videos, and let's hope this will work, or is the right approach, or the Chinese approach, or what it seems to be also the European approach in some ways, is the right one, and what are the alternatives?
Yeah, I think task specific, it's not just China and Europe. I've also seen really, really interesting applications that go along the task specific AI development approach in Latin America and in Africa. And basically, it's just resource constrained environments that are actually then truly thinking about how do we innovate with the limited costs that we can actually spend to get disproportional benefit from that cost. And it's really, Silicon Valley is basically the only place in the world where they can just pour extraordinary amounts of money and burn all of this cost without necessarily having any kind of benefit, proportional benefit to show for it. And one of the, I already talked about the data aspect of why task-specific AI models can work better. You're scoping out the data to actually do the thing that you want it to do at a high degree of accuracy. But there's also another argument, which is that when you try to make a system be general purpose, first of all, this is a tall order. Like when you talk to ChatGPT, if you talk to it in any other language than English, it already starts to break down. So is it even general purpose? Like it's really debatable. But the other thing is like from the company's perspective, the AI developer's perspective, it is incredibly hard to predict how someone is going to use what they're marketing as a general purpose tool. And so there are plenty of people that are going to end up using the tool in ways that it's actually not designed to do. And we've seen this time and time again, you know, with headlines of lawyers using these tools thinking that they can just like take the citations straight out of ChatGPT, and it turns out that all the citations are hallucinated and they've already entered it into court, or doctors that are using ChatGPT to transcribe patient interviews, or like to transcribe patient conversations, and those also being hallucinated. So what's entered into the notes is not actually what the patient said. And so you end up with all of these instances in which people are using the tool, not how it was designed, and then it ends up harming someone in a sensitive context. And so that's also the benefit of this task-specific AI approach. It's less costly. You're curating the data so that it's going to develop a much more highly performant model. And you can actually you can predict how users are going to use the tool and what the failure modes will be, such that you actually shore up those failure modes in advance instead of just unleashing it onto the population and then having it be sort of a grand experiment in what works.
Fabulous. We've had lots of questions. We've tried to cover some of the material in the questions coming through. Eduardo Pena, though, probably the most upvoted question, asks, what's the role of regulation here? So he refers about the EU AI Act. And, you know, obviously, you've explained earlier on that's not happening in the States at the moment. But do we think that the regulation of the EU is, for example, a positive way forward?
So the EU AI Act is really interesting because it was primarily drafted before ChatGPT came out. So it did end up shoehorning a bunch of things related to generative AI into the regulation, like right at the final hour. But that is probably the part I'm most critical of, in that it was not really thought out. And the European Parliament ended up taking a bunch of recommendations from from sources that, you know, are somewhat co-opted by the tech industry themselves, or by other kind of ideological players. And so I don't actually think there has been a very good model yet that we've seen for thinking about this governing these kinds of large-scale generative systems. I also think so. I guess the question of like, what is the role of regulation? We do need regulation first and foremost. And I also think that we need to think more broadly about how to regulate these systems, as not just regulating the applications once these systems have already been developed, but also thinking about how do we regulate the full supply chain of developing the system in the first place. So I do think the EU has been very ahead in actually having data privacy legislation. And to me, data privacy legislation is AI legislation. If these, like in the US, part of the reason why these companies are able to just hoover up all this data is because there is no data privacy legislation at the federal level. And that is part of what has allowed them to actually create these expansive models by extracting all of the data. Copyright law is also a form of AI regulation, in my mind. If the different governments around the world were actually to come down on an interpretation of copyright law that disallows these companies from training on these systems without credit or compensation to the original data creator, the IP creator, then that would also significantly kind of contain the imperial-esque nature of these companies and create much more of a power redistribution effect, where these companies actually then have to think about, like, how do we actually take some of the profits or revenue that we're earning and give it back to people that we've profited off of.
Yeah, I mean, I happen to agree very much about your assessment of the AI Act. And in fact, yeah, we do need a regulation, but we probably need a better regulation in general. And it was very interesting how the last minute addition of the general purpose AI, the Gen AI also kind of work was added. Also, from what I understand, because, you know, the Spanish presidency had to do it very fast by July or something, which is crazy. Yeah. Why would kind of power dynamics influence, you know, long-term kind of regulations? But that's the reality. That's how people are. So we have to live with it.
Quick, early on, you mentioned that actually none of this has got a real business logic to it. And actually, this money's being spent, vast amounts of capital. Theos mentioned the 100 billion that NVIDIA just decided to invest in OpenAI, which effectively is investing the money in its own customer. Is the snake eating its own tail? Are we due a bust in the AI space?
I think we are due for one, and I'm quite worried about how big it is going to be. And the reason why I say this is because when you think about the actual technical capabilities of these models and what those capabilities lend themselves, the type of task that those capabilities can actually perform quite well, it's a much smaller range than what these companies have been trying to sell. One really interesting thing is, when I talk with different businesses in different industries that are thinking about how to adopt AI, they don't know, like, they realize that they are overpaying for a general purpose model when, at the end of the day, they don't need something general purpose. They actually just need something that's like focused on financial applications or focused on healthcare applications or like focused on whatever, like the actual, like what they do as an industry. But it turns out that to get that 15%, they need to pay for the rest of the 85%. And they're like, why are we actually doing that? And so I've seen this trend where entrepreneurs are starting to think, wait a minute, this is a great market opportunity where I can actually build the smaller application focused AI models that just give businesses in different industries the cost optimized approach for adopting AI. And that in and of itself already shows you that, these companies that are trying to build these general purpose models, like how are they actually going to get that revenue back? Eventually, all of the businesses that they're trying to sell to are going to come to the same realization that they don't actually need the general purpose model. And then Silicon Valley is going to try to monetize the way that they always have, which is to provide things for free, but then monetize off of the data. And one question is that business model actually going to sufficiently cover for their costs? And the other question is, do we even want them to engage in the business model and extract so much value out of us and our data that it does cover their costs? And I think the answer to both of those questions is no. And so that's how the bubble pops.
Lots in here. Let me just a little bit close with a call to action, and then we do a round of last comment each of us may have for this. It sounds like we must not sleepwalk to a future we don't like. It's not inevitable. Things can become self-fulfilling prophecy, but that's part of sleepwalking. And definitely not in a future shaped by just a few, let's say, self-dealing AI emperors, if may I use this. We need to collectively consider alternatives and what's a more balanced path to a more balanced future can look like. And just to read the last sentence of your book, the very last sentence of your book, may it be a new ground upon which many more after will rise up and build, which is for your book, but hopefully also for all these conversations. Quick 3 minutes round, closing with one sentence each. I'll start, and Tim, you go, and then Karen, and then we call it a day. So I'll just probably repeat the following. If I was to emphasize one sentence, I really believe science is important. Therefore, I totally follow and believe in the initial mission of DeepMind. We shall solve intelligence and then use it to solve other problems, but we should do this intentionally and not by sleepwalking. Tim?
Karen, over to you. Final thoughts.
Technology is not inevitable, and I hope that everyone who came to this webinar feels coming away from it that you have an active role to play in shaping the future of AI development, whether that means investing in alternatives, building those alternatives, or simply continuing to put pressure on your elected officials as a citizen, or continuing to put pressure on these companies as a consumer in shaping the trajectory of AI development towards a much more globally and publicly beneficial direction.
Fabulous. It seems to me that we're the first generation to be impacted by AI. We're probably also the last generation who could really make a big impact on AI. And I think, Karen, your book has really helped give us a real message and a wake-up call that we need to go out there and play our role in that, as you say, as citizens, as customers, and hopefully as people on this call as business executives making decisions. So thank you for a fabulous time, and good luck with the storm.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Everyone.